Welcome back to Final Fantasy XIV. My name is Kumiko, and in this video, we'll be taking a look at how aperture values and depth of field work in this MMORPG. To start off, you may be familiar with the exposure triangle, a concept that determines photo exposure based on shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. However, I will say that ISO does not actually exist in Final Fantasy XIV, and neither does shutter speed. And all screenshots are taken with a quote-unquote balanced exposure, or in other words, an exposure value of 0 as opposed to -1, +1, or any other type of exposure value or exposure compensation. We'll be going over this later as I go through the photo capturing process. So I started off the day by just accepting a bunch of different quests and trying to do my best to just level up and get myself within the sort of environment of Ul'dah, because I felt that Ul'dah has plenty of potential when it comes to, capturing scenes and landscapes and architecture and just little vignettes of daily life in the city. So that's where I started. So my side quests led me to the steps of Thal, and specifically the Alchemist Guild. So my first photo today would be in front of that Alchemist Guild in Ul'dah, where a couple of alchemists are standing near a large torch. When lining up my composition, doing a 1-point perspective may seem the easy way out, but it's honestly the strongest solution. In order to obtain a proper sense of scale between the alchemist and the torch, I back up as far as possible and zoom in. Doing so also visually compresses the background a bit more and makes it easier to separate the subjects from the background. However, there is an issue with having the entire scene in focus, and that is that all of the background details are actually clearly viewable, so I need to rely on depth of field. Depth of field by default is based on the player character, in this case myself, so I need to manually focus as if I'm going to put the plane of focus on anyone or anything else. So the depth of field slider, by the way, which controls the aperture on real-life cameras to some extent, is actually very forgiving in Final Fantasy XIV. I would expect a zoom of 200, which is what we have here, equivalent to about an 185-ish millimeter full-frame zoom range, to actually have a much thinner depth of field at f1.4, as this looks more like f5.6 or f6.3, as it doesn't actually blow out the background as much as a typical f1.4 aperture typically would. That said, there currently does not exist a single zoom lens on the market or in existence that goes to an aperture of f1.4. The biggest aperture available on any zoom lens commercially is f2.8, which is 2 whole stops of light. But light gathering capabilities are different in Final Fantasy XIV, namely, there's no actual ISO value, which basically determines the sensitivity of a camera's sensor or the sensitivity of a slide of film. All images in Final Fantasy XIV are taken at the most balanced exposure in terms of light gathering, so an ISO value actually doesn't do anything. So here, aperture only affects the depth of field, and that's why it's called the depth of field slider. Something I must also mention here is that the aperture also has a different look depending on if you're playing the game in HD or 4K, at least when I'm looking at my monitor. When I convert my display to 4K, I actually have to go down to f1.4 to get an equivalent depth of field as an f2.8, as you can see right now on a 1080 screen or HD screen. And however, I must also say that my display is only in HD, and doesn't actually properly display 4K. So that's a potential factor as to why my aperture values appear to change, at least to me, visually. So, without further ado, I'll take the shot here, and I'll post it up on screen now. As is typical of architectural photography, without a tilt shift lens, I had to basically place my horizon line dead center of my frame, and so that means I end up with a lot of ground in my image, so I had to crop in the bottom of the frame so that the ground itself doesn't take up such a large part of the composition. I also made sure to capture at least the lower portions of the archway behind the torch to maintain a natural frame to the scene. In terms of post-processing, I didn't have much to do here, just increase the highlights a little bit and a tiny bit of white balance adjustment to preserve that warm feel to the scene. And of course, a slight bit of post-crop vignetting helps keep the visual attention toward the center of the frame. The only issue I found with this image is that the background doesn't actually quite blur as much as I'd like, so the banners behind the alchemist do take a little bit more visual attention than I'd like, and to me they feel like they're connected physically to the back of the alchemist somehow, although that's obviously not the case. And so here's where the aperture values in Final Fantasy XIV are a bit strange. And so with the first shot in the bag, I scouted around Ul'dah a little bit more, but I think a lot of these compositions will require a lot of working with the scene and just sort of figuring out some extra potential ideas, so those will have to be put on hold for now. So I decided to advance the main scenario quest, which took me to the Copperbell Mines in Thanalan. So again, after finishing the dungeon and after all of my teammates left, I wandered back through the dungeon to see what sort of compositions I could find, since I did see some interesting rock formations. This arrangement of minerals was likely caused by rapid cooling of molten rock, resulting in columnar basalt, at least on Earth, but this is the Eorzean equivalent, and it's actually much more colorful here. It took me nearly 20 minutes to work the scene and find this particular formation, and compose it properly against the waterfall backdrop. I also used G-Shade here in order to get a 1/5 second exposure. As I said earlier in the video, shutter speed cannot actually be controlled in this game typically, and the reason is likely due to hardware differences from player to player. In the real world, light is additive, so it takes time to create exposures and get the correct amount of light in your image. In-game, however, the amount of light captured through the computer screen is always kept at a constant, and so taking a timed exposure in-game would then rely on combining numerous frames during that 1/5 of a second. So in order to properly expose for this, an artificial isometer is also in G-Shade, which basically acts like a brightness adjuster based on the available light and frames within that 1/5 of a second. The first few timed exposures will always give you a dark frame, and this is due to the graphics card trying to catch up and process the frames occurring within that 1/5 of a second, and adding them onto each other to create a blurred image. After a few timed exposures, the image should come out to the proper maximum brightness, and if not, this is when you should adjust your ISO value. So here I went with an ISO of 200 to make sure the image comes out bright enough for me to work with. The added benefit to ISO in Final Fantasy XIV is that there's no noise due to the increased sensitivity of the camera sensor because, well, there isn't one. So while I didn't need to center my horizon dead center in my frame, I still needed to crop the image inward a bit, and I kept a 16:9 aspect ratio and the smallest depth of field at f1.4 in order to emphasize and isolate the subject in the center. The formation is also nicely framed in front of the waterfall to help isolate the formation from the rest of the rocks in the mine, which are the same color. The reason for the timed exposure, by the way, was to make sure that the detail in the waterfall was toned down a bit, giving it a sense of movement, as well to act as a finely textured backdrop to the subject instead of demanding more visual attention. A full second long exposure, for example, would have been too long, as smoothing out the water may give it that painterly effect, but it loses all of the detail and the dynamic nature of its movement. Now I would rather preserve a little detail to make the water still appear dynamic in an otherwise very still scene. The processing here was relatively straightforward. There's a strange light source inside of the water itself, so I lowered the highlights and increased the shadows, but also increased the white point and lowered my black point to keep the water itself bright with the tunnel in the back nice and dark. I then added a post-crop vignette to keep the visual interest nicely centered in the frame. And with that shot finally done, I decided to check the rest of the dungeon to see what else I could find. And I didn't have to go far to find my next composition, which would be this waterfall, basically, with some stones at the bottom. It took some time to get the composition just right, but I wanted to capture the entire waterfall within one frame, preserving the entirety of the rocks at the bottom of the waterfall, and also incorporate some foreground element in the form of the edge of the chasm in front of me. And now, this is the widest angle composition I've taken to date, and I'm mostly satisfied with it. I turned depth of field off for this image because I wanted the entire scene to be in focus. In real-world photography, it would make more sense to take multiple exposures and focus stack them in order to get one full image with everything in sharp focus. But the advantage of Final Fantasy XIV is that the entire scene can be in focus if you want it to be, and you can still capture it all in a single shot. So that's what I did here. Again, I took a timed exposure in order to slightly blur the water coming down the waterfall, but took care to preserve just enough detail to give it a good sense of motion. In-game wise, I took this at camera position 0 to get the widest angle, so here it is. So at around 16mm full frame equivalent, I didn't crop the image at all, and the post-processing was also relatively simple. I lowered the highlights and shadows, and kept my black and white points basically in place. The exposure was overall pretty good. I added a bit more of a dehaze effect to bring some extra clarity and sharpness to the colors, but offset the extra color saturation by actually reducing the overall saturation in the photo. But here I also did an adjustment to the luminance of two colors, orange and yellow. I noticed that there were some oranges in the background, which gave some subtle backlight to the rocks in the top quarter of the image, shining through the mine tunnel. So I bumped up its brightness, the luminance in other words, to make it a little bit more prominent and balance it out against the bottom 3/4 of the image. The yellows are a bit subtle, but they're actually scattered among the mosses growing along the walking paths here, so increasing their brightness helps make leading lines that draw inward from the left and right sides of the frame toward the center, at which point the visuals bring you toward the bottom of the frame by following the waterfall down. The only issue I personally feel with this image is that there's not quite enough space between the bottom of the frame and the closest edge of the cliff, which creates a point of tension in the photo once you reach the bottom. If I get to revisit this scene again, I'll very likely retake this photo and put a little bit more space down there so that the tension can be relieved a little bit. But in general, I am pretty content with this image's composition. My third shot today done, I traveled just as far to find my next scene, this one a bit more complicated. It's literally the remnants of the abandoned mining operation, and finding all the equipment strewn about along with even the mine tracks left in place, it gave it a sense of a liminal space. A location that was once full of activity, suddenly brought to a halt and suddenly abandoned. When a mine operation is done, usually the minecart tracks are taken out and reused in other mine prospects to haul out ore and waste rock, but you can tell just by looking here that even a minecart was overturned and all the equipment, including explosives, were left behind. Truly unusual for an abandoned mining project, and you can tell that the threat that my group dispatched earlier was certainly an immeasurable danger to the miners who had to seal off the mine in the first place. So here I stood on the blasting device in order to elevate myself above the ground just enough. I kept the center of my composition on the invisible horizon to keep my vertical lines straight, and zoomed out to a camera position of 50, so an equivalent of around 24mm full frame. I took extra care to make sure the post on the left and the boxes on the right stayed just in frame, and that I didn't cut them off or make a tangent against the edge of the frame. I also positioned the minecart tracks to end at the exact corner of the bottom left of the frame. I also had to slow down the shutter speed to 1/5 of a second again, just to blur the water, and therefore had to increase my ISO again to 200. I took the shot, and I'll put the image on screen. I went with a black and white process for this image, as there are greens in the rocks and oranges from the light coming from the blasting device and shining onto the bottom right of the frame, so reconciling those two colors proved to be much more difficult. A black and white process really helps focus on the main details of the image, the textures in the ground and the wood crossties of the tracks, the wooden boxes and the platform, the pulley system, and even the wood grain of the scaffolding. My only issue with this image is that the shot was a bit difficult to compose with the three main edge issues present: the post on the left, the tracks at the bottom left corner, and the boxes on the right. Reconciling these three elements while also maintaining a correct composition to maintain my vertical lines, while also standing atop a tiny blasting device, while also adhering to a nice zoom range, made this composition extremely difficult. And while I had mixed thoughts about it after processing it, looking at it now makes it much more interesting after I had time to process the scene and understand the story captured in this image. The image does appear more heavy on the right side, however, due to the very bright boxes on the right side of the frame, and while changing their color feels a bit dishonest to me, I decided to leave them a very light tone of gray to help tell the story of a chaotic evacuation, and that nothing ever really truly gets resolved in the situation that the miners had to face. And with that, I left the mine to finish the dungeon and headed out to Horizon, a small sanctuary in Western Thanalan. Thanks all for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.